Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and today we are ending our Fire and Maneuver Nation guides, tackling the second nation of the American Civil War DLC, and the last one that we have not covered, the Confederate States of America. The CSA is a quantity-based efficiency nation, which is a very interesting mix because efficiency is not a cheap perk. But because of that, the nation has the ability to sort of spam out efficiency units, and this gives it a very unique infantry tab. But on top of that, they also do not have any heavy infantry. But unlike the US that we talked about in our last guide, this one has a bit more higher quality units, being able to draw upon a more standard roster for cohesion options. It also has a pretty powerful cavalry tab and backs it up with a solid enough artillery tab to really give it a well-rounded nature. If you enjoyed today's content, make sure to like and subscribe for future content. We have now covered all of the fire and maneuver nations in different guides, so make sure to also check those out. But now let's go ahead and jump into the early period and talk about the units and how to build this nation. In the early period, the Confederacy is pretty hamstrung by a certain restriction, and that is the fact that it only has 2 rifles to work with. Every other infantry unit outside of the 2 you give rifles is going to be stuck with only smoothbores, making them have to play a very up-close and personal game. But unlike a nation like Prussia, who at least has breech loaders, the Confederacy has no such option. That is an exception with their cavalry, which do get a couple breech-loading carbines, but we'll talk about those later. But it does really restrict the Confederacy's ability to fight at range unless we go into very specific strategies. Regardless, let's start off by talking about the state militia. The state militia is a pretty basic militia unit with low health and with average health, low cohesion, and breakable. They don't last long in head-on combat, especially as militias don't get access to certain formations like open order. But they do retain some usefulness in being really cheap options to help fill out your lines. The Confederacy appreciates them to bulk out their numbers, as their units are not exactly the cheapest in the world since they all are running efficiency. The big benefit of them is that they are able to, as I said, bulk out your numbers, and they can help guard flanks or just provide a little bit of padding for your more valuable units to hide behind. You also have the volunteers, your basic line unit, 6 health and 3 cohesion with efficiency. They are pretty solid overall, being able to maneuver around quite effectively. They don't last long in head-on combat due to that lower cohesion, but efficiency gives them a lot of flexibility, able to quickly move between formations and then dash out of a bad place, or get into an advantageous one and then deal some punishment into the enemy. Relying on them can allow you to bring a massive amount of efficiency, which gives you a lot of power in that you are very unpredictable and the enemy will have a hard time countering what exactly you end up doing. You also have the skirmish detachment. With 4 health, 2 cohesion, skirmishing, breakable, and rugged, these guys are really cheap and they are a rugged unit. They also kind of suck. The main reason you really take these guys is for throwaway fodder. They don't last long in any head-on combat, but throw them in a forest, throw them in a town, in open order, and the enemy will have to dedicate at least a little bit of time and effort to dig them out. And seeing as they're one of the cheapest units the Confederacy has, that can have value. They can help bulk out your numbers as you need it, but otherwise they do kind of lack a little bit of purpose. You also have the Whitworth Sharpshooter. This is a very powerful infantry unit with efficiency and range drill and skirmishing. They are actually one of the most ideal infantry to put the rifles on. Range drill is the obvious option, but combined with the fact that they have access to efficiency, they can move into position, set up, and then unleash a devastating barrage on the enemy. Their only weakness is that they are a bit squishy, but they also are not exactly the most expensive unit out there, unlike certain other units we'll talk about in a second. This does mean that if you're going for a quantity-based build, a couple Whitworths can be a great way to boost your firepower without breaking the bank. Then we move on to regular infantry. Essentially, these are just volunteers with one more cohesion. They are more expensive, but they are more durable. They often, I find, form the foundation of a Confederate build. Efficiency is really strong, and 4 cohesion is enough that they can really last in firefights without too much issue. If you have the little bit of money to spare, regular infantry I find are generally superior to the volunteers just because of that extra cohesion point. You then have the Texas Brigade, essentially a regular infantry, but with rugged placed on them. This makes them very similar to that of the regular infantry, and these guys can be very good at flanking maneuvers. Rugged allows them to quickly dash through forests or across rivers and to flank the enemy, and their efficiency allows them to really pressure the enemy by just setting up and shooting or doing anything you need them to do. But they can also just be used straight out as additional regular infantry. You do only pay 10 more points for them, but that gives them a little bit of flexibility, and they can be very solid, giving you essentially four cohesion efficiency infantry to make use of. You then have the Louisiana Tigers, another 4 cohesion infantry with efficiency. These guys have shock, leaning them more so into the melee aspect. They are the only shock infantry the Confederacy has, and as such, they are one of the few options you have for melee. They're actually quite solid in that melee, being able to deal good damage on their charge. Efficiency allows them to get close without much problem, and they're generally quite flexible. The only downside is they do cost quite a bit, which can hurt them in the long run if you use them too wildly. Then we have the Stonewall Brigade, the heaviest infantry. These are the closest unit you get to a heavy infantry in the Confederacy, but man, they are actually quite strong. Although they only have the 4 cohesion, they have range drill, efficiency, and melee drill, meaning they are pretty much good at anything and everything you need them to be. They are good at shooting, they are good at melee, they can quickly get into formation or get into any situation that they are needed in. You do pay quite a lot for them. 200 as a baseline or 230 with rifles means they are not cheap, but they actually do quite a bit of work. They can deal a lot of damage, and they are just generally pretty strong and flexible. They're honestly very, very good. Then moving on to cavalry, we have volunteer cavalry. Essentially, this is a low health, low cohesion cavalry with breakable and disorganized. They're overall, the main purpose of the volunteer cavalry is that it is able to be very, very cheap. Equipped with just a basic rifle, they're a lot cheaper than that of the volunteers, and that can give them a little bit of use in terms of pressuring and keeping the enemy kind of on their toes if you flank them with these guys. And that can be useful. And especially because the Confederacy does not always have the largest army, you might have a little bit of money left over, and a volunteer can help fill that gap and be a bit of an annoyance for the enemy. Then you have the Bushwhackers. Essentially, it is a volunteer cavalry that traded out breakable for rugged. This does drive their price up quite a bit, but without breakable, these guys are also a lot more durable, and rugged is a pretty powerful trade on light cavalry. I like these guys quite a bit. They're able to quickly move through areas, they're able to flank quickly, and they're not too expensive, being about the same price as a basic volunteer when you put a smoothbore carbine on them, giving them a lot of flexibility. They're good at pressuring. They're overall, I think, a well-rounded option. You then have the Texas Rangers, essentially a souped-up version of the Bushwhackers. They have 1 more cohesion, and instead of disorganized, have shock. This makes them the most durable option of cavalry available to the Confederacy in terms of their regular options, or they're the most durable, rugged cavalry, but they do also pay a bit for that shock, meaning that you kind of want to use them in melee. And that can mean that, unlike, say, the bushwhackers, who are pretty comfortable sitting in terrain and shooting, the Texas Rangers might be best taken as a melee-only unit, largely used to flank around the enemy and then charge in and deal a lot of damage. They can be very good in that role. They're not too expensive for that, being similar to a lot of other shock cavalry, and although they do have a little less health, rugged does make up for that, in my opinion. Then you have regular cavalry. The regular cavalry has 6 health, 4 cohesion with efficiency and skirmishing. Overall, this is actually a pretty great cavalry unit. Given something like a breech-loading carbine does make them quite expensive, but such a high mobility efficiency cavalry with such good health can be really, really powerful. And with a breech loader, they can deal a decent amount of damage, being very effective at flanking. They overall, I find, can be a very useful all-arounder cavalry. And although they don't have any melee perks, even with just a basic smoothbore carbine, they can help pressure flanks very, very well. And then we have Hampton's Brigade, probably the single greatest light cavalry in the entire game. With 6 health and 4 cohesion, they're very durable. And then they have shock, skirmishing, and efficiency. There's just like nothing that Hamptons honestly can't do. They are great in melee because of their great stats and shock. They are great at shooting because of skirmishing, efficiency, and their great stats. They are very expensive. With a breech loader, they are $270, making them the most expensive unit in the early period. But that unit is able to do practically anything you need and just in general be very, very flexible. If you're only going to get one cavalry unit and you have the money to afford it, Hampton's is probably the best one to go with because it can just fill any gap you need and gives you some of that crucial melee perk that you otherwise don't have a lot of. Then we move on to the artillery. We start off with the 12-pound Napoleon. An overall solid artillery piece. 3 range is not always the greatest. However, the notable thing about this artillery piece is that it does not have cumbersome, unlike a lot of the other basic artillery pieces, which actually makes this a lot better than it seems. It's able to pivot and shoot. It can change formation and shoot. It's able to do a variety of things and still shoot, making it a lot faster to set up and actually affect the battle than other artillery pieces in other nations can. And that is actually really useful for the Confederacy, especially in the early period, where their lack of rifles can be an issue. A 12-pounder Napoleon can help compensate by giving you a relatively cheap artillery option, able to blast away at the enemy and overall deal decent damage. They are generally quite well-rounded and are effective in their roles of giving you range. You also can go with the heavier 10-pound Parrott rifle. With 4 range, these guys are essentially just a more expensive version of the Napoleon, but that extra range does mean they are also generally on the safer side while still being able to influence the battlefield. You're not going to be able to get as many of these guys as the Napoleons, although you're not generally getting a lot of artillery anyway. But this can be a very useful thing if you're only going to get one artillery piece to blast at the enemy and generally be effective. You then have the 12-pound horse artillery. It's essentially a Napoleon, but you pay an additional 40 points for 1 more movement speed, and that actually can be very useful. This doubles the speed of the basic Napoleon rifle and allows it to more effectively get into position, set up, and start blasting at stuff. And that is generally very effective. It's up to you whether or not you want to pay for that, but this can be another good option to buy. Then you have the 12-pounder mountain gun. The mountain gun is a 3-range rugged indirect fire howitzer. No cumbersome makes this very, very useful, and indirect fire is a very powerful perk. It is quite expensive, being on the same cost as the horse artillery. So if you're going to spend the extra on the horse artillery, you might want to consider the mountain gun as well, as its indirect fire can be very useful to shoot over your troops, meaning you don't have to worry about them blocking your artillery fire as much. On top of that, rugged means they can go and set up in forests and be a little harder to deal with. And then we round it out with the 12-pound howitzer. Essentially, it is a indirect 4-range howitzer. It's the longest range indirect artillery piece you have. It does have cumbersome, making it a bit clunkier to work with, but it's generally a effective piece if you really need to besiege an enemy. Set it up on, say, a hill, and it'll be able to cover a ton of range. It won't have to worry about line of sight being blocked, and it can be effective in that manner. When it comes to building the Confederacy, you can kind of lean on one of a couple different pillars. One could go with a emphasis on the range drill in order to combine that with things like artillery in order to build an effective deck. One could lean more so on the shock cavalry to build themselves, or one could even look to go more of a quantity-based build. This first one is aimed at doing that similar thing, relying on a very elite corps with double Stonewall rifle infantry and a Hampton's brigade with breech loaders to serve as your power units, backed up by then a bunch of cheap, spammable volunteers and a Texas brigade because we had a little bit of extra money to spend. This build doesn't have a lot of options to get into melee as the biggest downside. It's elite units having to be the ones to get their hands dirty if that's what you need, but it does give you a lot of firepower at range. Double Stonewall and Hamptons gives you a lot of damage, and you have a cheap bunch of throwaway units to swarm the enemy with. However, you can also go with a bit more of a, let's say, traditional build, emphasizing the reliance on cheaper units to help cover up anything you need. This build relies on double Texas and double regular infantry to serve as your foundation, being just 4 efficiency infantry with 4 cohesion. Double Whitworth serves as cheap rifle infantry with range drill on them. You get a bit more shock thanks to the Louisiana Tigers and the Texas Rangers we've fit in here. And then we even had room to fit in a 12-pounder horse artillery, giving us some mobile fire support. Or we could go with the mountain gun if we felt like it. This build is maybe a bit more of the traditional way to build the Confederacy because the 4 cohesion is definitely very, very useful, and then you still get a good number of units. But you can kind of go one way or the other. The only thing I would be careful of is going overly heavy on the cavalry. It is really good, and you can really get a lot of value out of it. But going double Hampton, double regular is asking for kind of a disaster because you're going to get shut out by fire at will and infantry lines, and you're not going to be able to win. So just don't overdo it with the expensive cavalry. If you're going to go with something like Hamptons, maybe get a bushwhackers or something like that. That can be an effective way to balance your costs. But now let's go ahead and jump over to the late period and see how the Confederacy changes and kind of reinvents itself. In the late period, the biggest thing that the Confederacy really receives is an update to its armory. First off, it now has 6 rifles available to it, giving it finally some options to shoot at range with. It also gets 2 breech-loading rifles, allowing it to shoot more up close and personal and maximize its damage. And then it also gets sharp rifles, rifled breech loaders. However, they are only usable on the sharpshooters themselves, meaning that you have to use them if you want that. In terms of new units, the Confederacy actually only has a single one, Gatling guns. Gatling guns are a efficient enough artillery piece. Its cost is about on par with a lot of other artillery, and although it's not as mobile, breech loading is very, very powerful on it, allowing it to deal a lot of damage, especially in concentrated where it goes up to 3 range. It is very squishy due to low health and cohesion, but its damage output can be incredibly high and outclasses pretty much any other artillery piece. When it comes to building the Confederacy in the late period, because of the greatly expanded arsenal, you can actually kind of go with a more quality-based build finally. not having to rely on as much of your ranged disadvantage as you did before. This build is definitely a much higher quality base build, utilizing a lot of different tools in order to essentially build out its roster. Double Stonewall Brigade with breech loaders are up close and powerful brawlers. You have double Whitworths to maximize it, giving you 4 range drill infantry with the ability to shoot twice per turn. You then have double regular infantry as your line. Regular cavalry with breech loaders is a very nimble and fast moving option. And then a volunteer and state militia to help bulk out your numbers a little bit so you don't run out of units too quickly. This is a very quality-based build for the Confederacy, and it can be effective, but it does also sometimes fold to pressure a bit quickly. Another option looks to go a bit more of the melee route, looking to get its hands dirty in the melee-centric battles. The benefit of this build is that you generally have a bit of everything to work with. A build like this emphasizes the effects of Louisiana Tigers and the Texas Rangers for a lot of shock relatively to other builds, and then has regular infantry and volunteers with rifles just serving as kind of your line units. You back it up with an artillery piece and a state militia, or we could go with something like a Gatling gun and a state militia. We have a variety of things here, but a build like this could be quite effective in terms of giving you a numbers advantage and allowing you to swarm the enemy down. In fact, we could even cut one of these and go with something like, say, a Texas Brigade. But you can build and customize those as you want. But that is the end of my Confederacy guide. It's overall a nation that is very interesting, being a quantity-based nation, yet having really good perks on like all of its units, kind of making a interesting amalgamation of different units. The sheer amount of efficiency means that it draws very similar comparisons to that of Prussia, and unlike Prussia, it lacks the armaments to be as much of a brawler. However, it does have more numbers and a far better cavalry tab, which gives it some different advantages and allows it to be aggressive in a different and unique way. If you enjoyed today's content, make sure to like and subscribe. I've now finished my series of guides for all of the nations in Fire and Maneuver, from the Boshin War to the American Civil War and all the base nations. And if you haven't checked them out, you can find them on my channel. But otherwise, that is all I have for you today. I want to thank you so much for watching this video and making it all the way to the end. And I want to say I really appreciate how a lot of people have watched all of these guides. It definitely means a lot, and thanks so much for enjoying them, and I hope that you have found them useful. But anyway, that's it, and I hope you have a good day.